Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that is tough on chlorinated chicken and tough on the causes of chlorinated chicken. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm a bit under the weather. I had yesterday I was supposed to be doing things and I just had the day off. I'm not feeling amazing, but I'm ready to record, and I'm probably feeling about the same way Parliament is right now.
Oh gosh, you decided to take a 5-week break then?
Oh, I wish I could. I wish I could take a 5-week break. So our main story tonight is, what hasn't happened? Maybe not this week. This week has been quieter, but not as quiet as you would expect when Parliament's not been sitting. But let's roll back to, we released an episode and we said, maybe a general election could come from this. And if it does, we've covered what that would mean, and we would just do our episode on our normal time. So we kind of covered ourselves for that eventuality. But an election hasn't happened, as is being pointed out in the chat. An election hasn't happened. And also, I don't feel like I've ever aged so much in 1 week. They say a week is a long time in politics. I feel like an hour was a long time in politics in that first week back of Parliament. Would you care to take us through everything? We're rolling back 12 days now to the 3rd of September. And this is Boris's first vote in the House of Commons. That's generally seen as quite an important thing. And how did that go?
Just before I get into that, I think me and you had a quick conversation just saying, should we do stuff on what's happened over the last 2 weeks, or should we do a silly season episode? And can I just say it has been the silliest of seasons in Parliament at the moment. Everything is happening. And like you said, it started off on September the 3rd with Boris Johnson sitting down, first day in Parliament. Right, lads, let's get this done. I'm going to do a little speech, and then we're going to have a vote on the Brexit thing. The Brexit thing was what we talked about last time on our podcast, which was the Ben motion that essentially said that Parliament wouldn't go for a no deal. It would postpone no deal on October 31st, and it would make Boris Johnson go to the EU and ask for an extension until January the 31st, 2020. He sits down and starts doing this speech, and basically before it's over, one Conservative MP, Philip Lee, crosses the floor. So crossing the floor in parliamentary terms means that you switch from one party to the other, and usually an MP makes an announcement before they do that, and then they go and sit with their new Change UK or Independent or Lib Dem chums. In this instance, there was no warning. Philip Lee just entered the chamber and literally walked across the floor to sit with the Lib Dems to the sound of applause from the other, backbenchers on the Labour and Lib Dem side, effectively losing Boris Johnson's majority before he'd even finished his speech.
I was going to say, it's impressive, and we will maybe concentrate on the Lib Dems a bit more. I wondered if we could just do a quick aside on what your thoughts are about Philip Lee being a Lib Dem.
Yes, so I'm torn. We've had the Lib Dems are clearly the party that are saying we are open to new people coming in. They have accepted a lot of people in their time, since 2017 coming into their party. Most notably, sort of the refugees from Change UK. Chukwuemeka being, one of the most high-profile member to go from Labour to Change UK, and when Change UK kind of failed or, didn't really make any impression in the local or European elections, joining the Lib Dems. They are clearly quite a broad church that wishes to, get those people who are seeking a centre ground, and particularly one that, the Lib Dems had their party conference today and said that they would vote to stop Brexit. They would revoke Article 50. So it's another home for MPs like that. But with a man like Philip Lee in particular, who has such a questionable record on... He voted no against gay marriage, didn't he? Essentially, against equal marriage. And he's had a very shoddy voting record when it comes to LGBT rights. And being a Lib Dem and having a party that has been so strong on LGBT rights from the beginning, they were the party that was there before any others, I feel. To have a man like that join, I think it quite rightly provoked such a very strong reaction. I know that it led to, I think, the leader of the LGBT section of the Lib Dems resigning on the day that he joined. Quite rightly so. Sorry, you might have more details.
Well, so I happen to have a bit more info on that purely because one of my friends actually messaged them directly on Twitter and had a conversation with them, partly in the open and partly in direct messages, saying, what is it just the Philip Lee thing? And they were kind of like, no, it's a bit broader than that, really. It's like that was the reason. That may have been the inciting incident right now, and they did write a piece on their blog about that. But I think it was more than that as well. Like kind of, I think the problem being like, well, we'll accept anyone as opposed to specifically him. It was just kind of, yeah. But they were like, I'm really sorry, but like I have to step down because I can't agree with all of this. But yeah, I just as usual, there's a bit more nuance to it than the takeaway headline.
Yeah, of course. I just, it was said that was like the straw that broke the camel's back, I'm assuming, in that instance. And yeah, it's certainly a controversial thing to do when you are the Lib Dems. As I did in my kind of preamble, they're in an odd situation. They have very few MPs, and the 2017 election wasn't a good one for the Lib Dems. But they are a party that has grown and is taking in more and more people as the Brexit thing, as other parties spiral out of control and fail to keep them together. So Joe Swinson's approach is a bold one. But again, when you're accepting more people, or if you are broadening your church, you're also going to lose people along the way. And I think, personally, I would have rather Philip Lee stayed an independent and we would have kept people, like your friend you were messaging on Twitter, because that's, who I would prefer to be in the party than Philip Lee. But we will see how this tactic works, the Lib Dems, at the next general election, as I say, which will be fairly soon, I feel, even if not quite so imminent.
Sorry, just to clarify, I didn't DM them personally, but a friend of mine did, and a lot of the issue seems to be the overly political welcome message that was putting praise on Philip Lee that came from Joe Swinson. So,
okay.
I think if you can find that website, you can find that message, and it is, and I think it probably ties into the fact that Joe Swinson was one of those people who was in the coalition. So I think there's a kind of, that's the kind of thing that fills me with unease as well, that this could be doing stuff purely for political gain, and I get that that's how politicians work, but also you feel like, the Lib Dems try and fill that kind of middle ground, and it does come across as a bit like, oh, we'll take anyone. It's oh, you're great because we're welcoming you to the Lib Dems, and I'd love to say that someone could join the Lib Dems and be I'd love to say that someone could join the Lib Dems and be converted and change their mind on these things by being involved in that group of people. But often I think you have to look at the voting record of someone and see where they stand. So I think it's kind of like, oh, he's so great because X, Y, and Z. And I'm sure he has done some good things, but also on this side of things that we care about, that's pretty bad. And it's an interesting line to walk. And I think we'll get to this later on, but as you said, a lot of people have been joining the Lib Dems recently. And I do feel somewhat like the next Change UK person to join, who has a strong LGBT rights record, was kind of almost like, it was like a day or two later, almost to kind of try and deal with that criticism. But the problem is you've still got that person in the party, haven't you? So
precisely, yeah. And I think the Lib Dems have always stood for quite a, quite a few issues. Like I said, LGBT rights is something they've always been very strong on as a party right from the beginning. So you don't want to start undermining some of your core principles just because you're trying to invite more people into the party. There was, I think I mentioned it. It was Stephen Bush actually who writes for the New Statesman, saying that he found it bizarre that Vince Cable was on there sort of lamenting the fact that Philip Hammond wasn't in the Conservatives, and if only he could find a home. He was saying it was odd to see Vince Cable talk that way about Philip Hammond when he knew of the personal struggles that there had been in the coalition between Vince Cable and Philip Hammond on a very personal level in there, like how much politics has changed since 2015 and now who is willing to take people into their party. A lot of things have changed, and the way that goes now, it will define a lot of politics as we see it over the next 2 years.
I suppose moving back then to where we were, had a bit of a side there about the Lib Dems, and they will come up a lot, as I mentioned in this week's episode. So he moves across the floor. So that meant Boris no longer had a majority. Is that correct?
That is correct. He was now
an official majority, but there was an independent guy who still essentially voted with the Tories on everything. I've forgotten his name, but he gets mentioned every time someone talks about majority, because a lot of this, a point I'm not sure if I've made on the podcast, but I've discussed with a few people online, is that the majority is all well and good when you're talking about traditional party line stuff. When we're talking Brexit, it could mean nothing. Like, it depends on the vote. I mean, if it's a vote where Labour will often vote against something Boris is doing because that's what the party's doing, but there's freedom there if it's a vote on Brexit itself for the Brexiteer Labour Party members to vote differently. So it's a functional majority a lot of the time, but maybe not always, with that change to a zero majority on paper.
Yeah, precisely. But it's a little personally embarrassing for the Prime Minister to say that he's lost his majority within an hour of actually sitting in the chamber. So the maths of it is. So Boris has had this, very public humiliation right at the start. He carries on, and then they go ahead to, it's all building up to the vote to see if Parliament will adopt this amendment to the bill that says that Boris has to go to the EU and demand an extension. Before this, Jacob Rees-Mogg gets up and speaks to the House. In between this, there is a scene on BBC Parliament where Jacob Rees-Mogg is seen reclining on the front benches of the chamber, recumbent as the Green Party leader, I've forgotten her name, Caroline Lucas, told him to sit up straight, man, and this just became instantly memeable as an image, and I think for the Conservative Party, you hear people talking about optics, like what are the optics of the situation? Does it look good or look bad? It looked really bad. It looked like a privileged posh boy thinking that he owned the chamber and was able to lie back whenever he wants. And personally, I feel that if I was the Labour Party, I would have that image on every poster when it comes to the next general election. I think even the pressure group led by donkeys, who are the ones who were publishing the tweets of Leave campaigners before the referendum, kind of say, like, look, they promised you this and they haven't delivered it. They projected on the side of Edinburgh Castle an image of Jacob Rees-Mogg lying back on the front bench, and underneath it just said "lying Tory" along the bottom. So there's a lot of potential memeable stuff.
Well, I was going to say that the best one is that he has turned up in leak form, and he's turned up in leak form as Jacob Leaksmog at a Onion show. So yeah, that'll definitely be in the show notes. Go and enjoy that picture. That's hilarious.
So Jacob does that. Then they go on to the actual vote itself, which Boris Johnson loses. As we've been talking on the podcast before, he was expected to lose this, and he lost it because there were a lot of Conservatives that went against him. That list of 22 that were going to go vote against, they all did. And as a result, they immediately lost the whip and became independents. This is quite a shock for a lot of people. I think one of the most notable was Ken Clarke, who now becomes he's now an independent Father of the House. That hasn't happened in hundreds and hundreds of years. There were also people like Philip Hammond, who was...
Sorry, just for our listeners' benefit, yeah. What is the Father of the House?
Oh, sorry, the Father of the House is a title given to the longest-serving, continuously serving MP in the Houses of Parliament.
Okay, so it's just whoever's been there the longest.
Yes, yeah. So he becomes an independent. Philip Hammond, who had been a cabinet minister in the former government, now an independent, chucked out. A lot of people said that this was a very brutal move by Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, who is the Leave.U director, who became Boris Johnson's advisor. He apparently is the mastermind behind this plan to try and chuck them out the party as soon as possible. It's just not the done thing, and there are a lot of people left sort of questioning their loyalty to the Conservative Party and what they do in the future. There's kind of an unwritten rule in political parties that you keep the faith, or you don't chuck somebody out of the party until they really are basically voting for Labour. There's a lot of things that you can do before you can chuck them out. Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, has rebelled against the Conservative Party over 100 times and is still a Conservative. I think Philip Hammond and Dominic Grieve have rebelled less than 10 times, but because they did it at the wrong time, they are now out. It was Boris laying down the law to the Conservative Party, but it also meant that his majority went down even further than before. And this is where I get my picture of Jacob Rees-Mogg again, because one of my favourite Jacob Rees-Mogg memes was the majority one, which I can see if I can find.
Amazing.
It's not quite to scale, that one, but it's a picture of a recumbent Jacob Rees-Mogg with the government majority from 2017 to 2019 slowly going down to -1 and then down its leg to -43 as they get rid of all of those MPs of the party.
I was going to say, it was a bit interesting. I mean, it was interesting to watch because it was like, hey, I'm going to do this. And everyone went, no, he wouldn't do that. And then they all voted. And he went, okay, yeah, I'm going to have to do that because I said I would. So he then couldn't lose face. And now suddenly he's lost this majority. Like, as you say, it's like, I mean, I unprecedented, question mark? Probably. There's a lot of stuff going on right now that is unprecedented, but I honestly have lost track.
I'd say it is too. When you know your majority is so small, it's sort of an act of self-destruction to chuck those people out the party. Like you say, a lot of them who are independents will probably vote with the government on other matters that aren't Brexit. But when it comes to Brexit, and that's the one thing that he's trying to, push through, it's a really high-risk strategy. And once again showed that the only way out of this mess for Boris Johnson was to call a general election.
As we said, he's going to have to call a general election now. And we said there were several things that could happen to cause him to call a general election. So he was like, okay, I need to call a general election. And as we know, he has to have a vote on that because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So how'd that go?
So he schedules a vote for the next day, September 4th. So we're still on the Boris timeline of you've lost a majority by 1, you've lost your first Commons vote, you're now down to a majority of -47 in the Commons. It's okay. You can turn it around come Prime Minister's questions. So this is the chance for him to show off Boris's famous verbal dexterity, his skill. He was a host on Have I Got News for You? He was Mayor of London. Of course he's going to be great at this. As it turned out, he was really rubbish. And I was surprised by how rubbish he was. His performance was blustering, but not in a funny way. He shouted into the mic, which is kind of a rookie PMQs mistake. He swore in the House. He was talking about Labour's economic policy. He described it as shit. He got told off by the Speaker because he referred to Jeremy Corbyn and not the Right Honourable Gentleman across from him, so he was breaking parliamentary procedure. And again, I mean,
Boris has been in Parliament for a long time. It's not like he is a new up-and-coming person who's suddenly become PM. He's been there for a long time. He knows how this works.
So, it's a shock that he would do it so badly. I think ultimately it's, when it comes to PMQs, it's not the debating halls at Eton. It's not that kind of student union style, back and forth. You've got to be Prime Minister of the country, and that comes with some responsibilities that Boris doesn't seem to have a handle on yet. I've talked about, it was said in another piece that I read that Boris Johnson's speaking skill once worked because he was a bit like a toddler at a nativity play. He knew the words he wanted to say, but he struggled to get them out. And as a member of the audience, you really wanted him to succeed. You wanted him to get those words out. So therefore, that's why people thought, Boris Johnson, he's a bit of an idiot, but, I like him. He's affable. Now at PMQs, and now when he's doing speeches and he can't get the words out, he just looks like a bumbling idiot. He looks like a buffoon. He's got less people out there rooting for him and more people who are wanting him to fail. So when he struggles, then he's not getting that sort of sympathetic feeling about him anymore. And I think that became very apparent during PMQs. he also had some of his past catch up to him, I think.
There was a brilliant moment where, content warning for racism, but he famously made a comment about hijabs looking like letterboxes, which was obviously at the time, I think he had to give a formal apology.
One of his many formal apologies in the Telegraph, yes. I think after him...
who hasn't he offended? But that's a particularly bad one. And I'll try and find the clip to put in the show notes, but there's a brilliant clip of him being taken to town by one of the Labour MPs, who I think was a Sikh MP, but was just like, this is not okay.
Yeah, and to do that on day one, to say, look, you might be Prime Minister, but you've done these things in the past and you need to be held accountable, which is kind of what PMQs is all about. It's about holding the Prime Minister and the executive to account. That was a very powerful speech that garnered a lot of support from across both benches. And Boris's excuse or his retort of, I'm just defending liberal free speech, I think really fell flat again. So that's definitely a clip worth seeking out and will be the type of attacks that Boris Johnson has to expect at Prime Minister's questions. I think it's one of the great things about the British political system that the Prime Minister is held to account weekly. I think a lot of people in the US would like to see a similar style of debate happening with Trump. Trump goes to the House of Representatives every so often to sort of open it, but is free from any personal questions from the floor. Boris Johnson has to answer questions from MPs as they come in PMQs. So he can't dodge that or sidestep that like he used to. So he's going to have to get a lot better at responding or be a better Prime Minister, essentially.
Just a bit of live follow-up from the chat. It was not a hijab, it was niqabs and burqas, which are importantly distinct, and I have got this wrong before, and I apologise. It's not okay what he said, regardless of what it was about. Yes.
So, after PMQs came the second and third readings of that of the bill, the Ben bill that had come before, and again the government lost both the second reading and the third reading, meaning that it would now pass to the House of Lords. So now Boris Johnson knows that if it goes through the Lords, it will be passed into law. He's going to have to go to the EU and demand this extension. So his grand plan is to demand a general election. He can do this under the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. However, Parliament needs to pass it with a 2/3 majority.
Which, given the majority he has... given the majority he had at that point in time, seemed unlikely.
But however, I think, as you'll remember last week, I was saying, he'll get that general election, because why would Labour not call an election? Why would they not want to do that? You know, they were in a very poor position when Theresa May tried to call one last time, and they said, yeah, bring it on. I was expecting them to do it right over again. So what happened, Tom?
Well, Labour mostly abstained, so it's important to point out here that it's a 2/3 majority of all MPs, not a 2/3 majority of those who vote. So abstentions are tantamount to voting against, essentially. Yeah, most of Labour abstained, I think. Did any of them vote for? I think it was either against or abstentions, right?
I think 3 voted for. Let me see if I can grab there's commonsvote.digiminister, which is a great site. I'll put that in the chat. That gives you the results of all the votes and tells you who voted for what. There will be an early parliamentary general election. There were 268 for, 56 against, of which... there were some Labour.
Oh, yeah, K2E.
The usual suspects. Ronnie Campbell, Kate Hoey, and... the other one. Stephen Hepburn. Yeah, those 3 are quite prominent Brexiteers in the Labour Party who seem to vote with the Conservatives on every Brexit matter. So, yeah, there were 3 Labour MPs who voted for it, but yeah,
But still, a 2/3 majority when you don't have a majority, quite tricky.
Yes. And so I was definitely wrong on this situation. I'm quite happy to have been wrong. And now I will explain all the reasons why I was wrong when I was so certain that there would be a general election last time we spoke. So why was it a good tactic? So who was it in the chat who said, I don't think there'll be a general election? It was Ask Who, wasn't it? I think you got it in. Yeah, you got it entirely right. that Labour decided it would be better to sit on their hands and wait this out. So Labour's tactic, as they've said quite openly, is we don't want to dance to Boris's tune. We know that Boris Johnson wants this election. He's been gearing up for an election, and this is a bad time for us to have an election. We want to first stop no deal from happening and get that into law, so he has to extend it. And once that is secure, we will then have enough time to have a general election, which Labour say they will go on and win. This seems like a fairly good strategy because it means that Boris Johnson doesn't have to Boris Johnson isn't given the opportunity to run down the clock on this even more. So he's already prorogued Parliament for 5 weeks. If we have a general election as well, then Parliament would enter a state called Purdah, which is a state where Parliament can't pass.
Be seen to be. Oh, sorry, am I confusing that? Because that's the point where members of the civil service can't talk about stuff because they might be showing favour one way or the other, so they can't talk about anything political, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, so that would stop things like Yellowhammer documents and other Brexit documents going out. It would also stop the government itself from acting. Parliament would be shut down for even longer. I think it's at least 6 weeks for your average campaign now. And so Boris Johnson would, he'd call for the general election on October the 15th. That would mean he would have 2 weeks just before the Brexit deadline to come in with what he would hope would be an increased majority. And it would play rightly into, exactly into his hands. Labour's point of view is saying, no, we will secure this no deal and make sure that we avoid this no deal scenario. Then we'll call the general election. It's still led to a lot of things that I said would happen, and the attacks from the Conservatives have been predictable. So Boris Johnson has called Jeremy Corbyn a chlorinated chicken. Conservatives are saying that, you've called for election all this time. Why don't you want one now? Buck, 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 buck. That's me being a chicken, by the way.
Leading to possibly the worst Photoshop of all time in The Sun.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
In the chat for everyone who hasn't seen it.
Yeah.
Wow, it's so bad.
That's bad. The bizarre press conference with JFC Chicken. I don't know. Did you hear of any of this when it went out on Twitter?
No, that's your link there is the first time I've heard of that. Whereas the chlorinated chicken thing was all over the place.
So Dominic Cummings or somebody came up with this chicken pun laden statement about how Jeremy Corbyn's too chicken to call an election. Photoshop him into that with JFC and call it totally spineless chicken, which again doesn't work because JFC is the name of the chicken, I guess, but KFC stands for Kentucky Fried Chicken. So totally spineless chicken, the acronym for that would be TSC. That doesn't make sense. JFC also stands for Jeremy fucking Corbyn, which makes him sound badass. You can bleep that out. I don't care. At the actual event itself, they presented journalists with their own brand of JFC chicken, which, imagine you're a Conservative who's never walked into KFC before, but somebody's kind of texted you about it and tried to explain it in that sense. It was like a weird bucket with a bit of chicken that somebody had got from the shop and then just put one piece in the bucket. It wasn't breaded or anything. It looked horrible. And I know journalists said that one of them ate it just to give it a try, but it really was. I think all the journalists in the room were sort of looking at each other going, is this really happening? Yeah, it just looked particularly bad chicken. Journalists were thinking, is this something out of the thick of it? And the fact that KFC clapped back by saying this is KFC, not LBC, don't at me, was also embarrassing. So it's showing that the Conservatives' kind of childish tactics on this are backfiring slightly. And ultimately, because Labour have said, no, we'll call an election once this no deal thing's sorted out, once an election is called and Labour have voted for it, the whole chicken argument goes out the window. It's not important. That doesn't feature in an election campaign. It's only a very small boost at the moment to the Conservatives saying, buck, buck, buck. So, yeah, the tactics from the Conservatives have been poor here, and Labour certainly haven't been baited into calling that general election yet, and I don't think they will be.
that's 2 days we've covered. We've been recording for a while.
It's just like...
Just so you know.
Sorry.
No, that's not to you. That's to the listener who will hear an edited version of this where I've had to streamline it and everything. But we'll see. Well, I'll talk about that a bit later as well. So September 5th. Could Boris Johnson do any worse? Yes, is the answer. So, Joe Johnson. Sounds like a name we might have mentioned before. Brother of Boris Johnson. What did he do on September the 5th?
He stepped down as a minister, saying that he was torn between family and national interest, in a move where many joked that he'd resigned to spend less time with his family. The brother of Boris Johnson stepping away, basically saying, "Sorry, brah, I can't do this," after a mere 2 days in government is very embarrassing for Boris personally, and a lot of people say that hit him quite hard. It was a shock, and Joe Johnson has gone on to say that he will probably step down as an MP when the next election comes round. But it was another example of how those around Boris were losing faith with him, particularly those who he'd tried to keep on board. We've always said that Boris is quite Brexity, but there were a couple of Remainers within his cabinet who had stuck with him on the promise that he was going to get a deal, and he genuinely believed in getting a deal for the country. As those sort of arguments slipped away, more people felt that they just couldn't, in their conscience, stay in a government like that, so decided to leave. So Joe Johnson leaving was a big body blow for Johnson. After that, he also did a speech at a police academy up north.
The only thing I have to say about that speech is bad optics.
Yes.
Standing in front. Now, I know, I this is no offence to the police officers who are there. That's like a training academy, of course. But getting the Prime Minister giving a speech with a wall of people in police uniform behind him definitely sends the wrong message when you glance at it. If you actually watch the speech, it's very clear what's happening. But out of context, it doesn't look great.
No.
See, that picture that's been posted there looks fine because there are police watching him talk. But I've seen versions of it where it's just him with police behind him, like a wall of police. And I don't think they were doctored, just, differently cropped, which is a whole other thing about how the media does stuff. But it wasn't necessarily the best optics.
No, and the speech itself was bad. There was a clip that did the rounds of him trying to say the rights, you do not have to say anything, but if you do, then, it'll be taken down. He rambled on for about 55 seconds, which is more than I ramble on, so very impressive, Boris. And he rambled on so long, in fact, over the whole thing, that a police officer fainted behind him, which is, again, bad optics. Theresa May had letters fall off behind her, but having actual people dropping like flies behind you is probably worse. So, at the end of that day, the 5th of September, 3 days into official parliament going on, Boris Johnson has had maybe like a PMQs and this speech go terribly badly for him, sort of like car crash bad, and has lost every single vote that he's had in the House of Commons so far. Not a great time for the PM so far. Couldn't get any worse, could it?
Yeah, you'd say that. And then the weekend happened.
Yes, so nothing bad can happen over the weekend, right? Boris Johnson is thinking, at least it's the week.
Be fine.
Just then, out of the blue, a former ally of Theresa May, Amber Rudd, resigned from her ministerial role too, and in doing so, she said that she resigned the Conservative whip as well. This was another person who'd been quite strongly Remain. She'd kept the Boris line up until that point, but the fact that she resigned on the Saturday, essentially so she could go on the Sunday morning programmes, in particularly Andrew Marr, and talk about her reasons for leaving the Boris Johnson government so soon, really showed that Boris had caused quite a massive rift within the Conservative Party. The referendum was meant to put this all to bed, and now the Conservative Party is probably at its most split it's been, with lots of former ministers leaving the party. I think many on that day also joked that even Boris's new dog had left him to join the Lib Dems.
Yes,
so, it was a bad time overall for Boris, and I think it was only going to get worse.
And that brings us to what would have been Monday, which is September 9th, the last day of Parliament before it's prorogued. There's a lot going on here as well. So he wants to go for another general election vote on. I'm not 100% sure about the reasoning for that. You might be able to give me a better explanation of why he thought that was a good idea, or was it just kind of to show that he still wanted a general election? Is that the idea, do we think? Or did he actually think he might be able to get that vote through?
I don't think he could get it through. I think it was another last chance to kind of say, can I bait enough Labour people into doing this? Maybe if I go to the country after Parliament's back and saying, look, Labour not only once turned down my offer of general election, but twice, maybe that'll have double the impact. But no, it just made him lose another vote he was going to lose. Also, he lost another crucial vote, which was tangentially related to Brexit. There had been a lot of fuss about Parliament being prorogued so early, and there were challenges in the court, and people knew that there were papers within the government that may give some details about that that could help judges. And many people thought it was in the national interest to see if Boris Johnson had, in fact, misled the Queen over the proroguing of Parliament. There was also tied into that the release of the Yellowhammer documents. So Yellowhammer was the name of the civil service papers that outlined the possible scenarios that would happen in a no-deal Brexit. Those within Parliament thought it was very important to have these released because that would give people time to prepare, or we'd know what the actual consequences of a no-deal Brexit were. The government was less keen to give these out, saying that, they might panic people or it's not in the public interest to do so. He lost that vote as well, and the papers were released, mostly showing the same as the papers that had been leaked to the Sunday Times a few weeks before. Of course, at the time, I think the government said that those were documents that were from the May era.
Out of date or something like that, yeah.
Yes, but the documents were actually dated from August, which would have been in the Johnson period. I think there was a slight rewording that the base case scenario, which was the one that said that there would be medicine shortages and port closures, the title of that document was changed to sort of like worst case scenario. So even now we're not quite sure where in the civil, like how likely that scenario is. Is that the base scenario, or is that the worst case scenario where we have these shortages of medicine or food prices go up? But it certainly was embarrassing for the government to release those to say, this is what the civil service, somebody whose job it is to take an abject view of what will happen in no deal. There's very little political spin that can happen within these documents. Them saying that there would be food shortages and those who would suffer most would be those on the poorest income who would be most affected by those food price rises. That's quite damaging to the government to show all those things to them. So, Boris Johnson in the end ended up losing 6 out of the 6 votes, which, as somebody in chat has mentioned, he becomes the beating the record of the previous Prime Minister to lose his first 5, who, of course, was Boris Johnson as well. I've never known, Prime Ministers usually when they start, obviously they've won a general election to get in and they've got a majority. So this doesn't happen very often, Prime Ministers losing votes in the Houses of Parliament. To lose your first 6, 100% losing record, and to think that he wanted a general election, one which he could lose, he could potentially go down in history as, statistically the least successful Prime Minister that Great Britain has ever had. So at least he's breaking records.
Which is pretty impressive, considering, people had a lot of choice words about Theresa May, but by comparison, it's been something I can't broadcast.
Well, I can't remember where the tweet was. Somebody did a big list of the amount of losses that governments, that the Prime Minister has had while they've been in charge. Theresa May led the way with having 33 votes lost in Parliament. But Boris Johnson, if he continues down the same path, losing 100%, 6 out of 6 is huge, and it shows what a tumultuous time this is for Parliament, and in particular the executive. The executive has very little control in a Parliament that is more polarised than ever. You should be when you've got such a small majority, you should be looking to reach across the bench and find a coalition partner or somebody to work with so you can get your agenda through. this has quite clearly failed under the current Johnson government because he's gone for such a hard Brexit strategy. And that's why he wants a general election. The only way out of it is by redoing the parliamentary math and hoping that you come out with a more pro-Brexit MP base to force your agenda through. Because at the moment, none of it's getting through. Whatever he tries, it's just not passing water. Passing water? That's not the phrase. It's just not passing.
It's just not going to get through.
Not going to get through.
Okay. So, yeah, Yellowhammer Papers came out. I saw a good joke about that where it was like a picture of the bird, the yellowhammer, being like, what did I do? And then we talked about proroguing Parliament. So this is an interesting thing I think we touched on in the previous episode. Proroguing Parliament, the only kind of way to undo it, because the Queen is always right, essentially, in law, is that it is to say that she was misled by her ministers. So that's the angle these judges have gone down. So we had the Scottish court hearing it, and also which UK court was it?
I can't remember which one it was. It was a High Court in London. Anyway, I know that one. Okay,
so they basically ruled one way or the other. So the Scottish judges ruled that the decision was unlawful, and the UK High Court ruled that it was lawful. So that means the only way to fix that is it has to now go to our Supreme Court and be heard quickly to deal with it. The reason given there is that the UK High Court basically said, this is a political decision, we can't be involved because we're judges. It's politics, not the law. And then the Scottish judges, I think the technicality they went with was that it was... I can't remember. Can you fill me in on that? I've just had a blank on exactly what they said.
Let me just see if I can find the BBC News article and get the facts, because I'm... So the Scottish government said that he was motivated... He was motivated... Sorry, the Scottish court said that he was motivated by the improper purpose of stymieing Parliament, and in that fact, he had effectively misled the Queen in advising her to suspend Parliament. So usually proroguing Parliament is a very normal thing. We talked about that last time. That's what you normally do when the Queen's speech has happened, and Boris Johnson has always said, like, this is a normal thing, this is exactly what any government in my situation would do, and the Scottish court has turned around and said, no, there's some very particular circumstances here and a very specific reason why it would benefit you to prorogue Parliament in this way. Therefore, we think that it's unlawful. Which might be quite, I think everybody at the time, that's why it's brought such a fuss. Everybody was clearly saying, you're doing this to carry political favour and to further your agenda, where usually proroguing Parliament is a totally non-political decision. It's just, okay, Parliament's starting again. That's fine. So, yeah, it goes to the Supreme Court now, which, I always thought, like, oh, can't it just go there first? But the Supreme Court only hears appeals. So, you have that decision, then the government will appeal the Scottish court's decision, and essentially what the Supreme Court says will be final. They start meeting on Tuesday, so hopefully we'll find out quite soon. And then if the Supreme Court rules in a certain way, then Parliament will be forced to reconvene.
Return, yeah. And also, so if proroguing Parliament breaks up a parliamentary session, and then the proroguing is deemed unlawful, does that mean that the session kind of clock restarts, including all those days in between, or is that just an unnecessarily specific thing?
I don't know the actual... I can't say that I know the actual answer to that, but I would assume that the Queen's speech is kind of the starting gun for the start of the next session. So if the Queen's speech doesn't happen, then the parliamentary session didn't end and Parliament was never prorogued. So I assume they would just keep adding days onto the last one rather than starting it again. Because they go for breaks all the time. They've just come back from their summer break again, but the parliamentary session was still very long.
Yes, yeah. And then that also led to stories of people turning up and MPs and so on turning back up in Parliament and like doing the stuff they're allowed to do while Parliament is prorogued and being like, well, we're still here. So it's got interesting. Yeah. So we're in this pickle.
Mm-hmm.
We still haven't had a general election, despite our thoughts that we might have one. Where do we go next? We're into conference season. Parliament is prorogued, maybe. Yeah. Where are we going?
So I mean, it's really hard to tell right at this moment. I think a lot of it does rest on that Supreme Court decision. If it's ruled as unlawful, then I think Parliament will try to do all in its power to get back there, get that, make sure Johnson goes to the EU as quickly as possible to pass on that letter, and then the focus will be directly on, does Boris Johnson break the law by not following the will of Parliament, or does he find some loophole around it? There have been some saying that, he may refuse to sign the letter and a civil servant may have to sign it on behalf of Boris Johnson, and he goes to the EU and demands that extension. Or he might say that the whole process is unlawful anyway and kick off another court battle. I think that's a very real possibility if Parliament comes back early. If it doesn't, then we will roll into conference season. It's the Lib Dems first that's happening. Well, theirs happening now.
Happening as we speak.
Yes. I've been to a Lib Dem conference before. Always very friendly affairs. That was during the coalition, so it was interesting to see the see the protests outside. I think the Lib Dems were quite surprised because it's the first time they'd sort of had any attention like that. It's just nice to be noticed, So yeah, that was the height of Clegg and the coalition. So the Lib Dem conference is going on. Then I think it's Labour and the Conservatives. Let me just check to see if that's right. It goes Lib Dems starting on Saturday the 14th, then Labour a week after, the 21st, and then the Conservatives on the 29th of September. The Lib Dems have already done most of their big policies. I think they're one saying that they would, if elected, would seek to revoke Article 50 is one of the most striking. It shows that, once again, they've said we can't have it shows everybody's there on election footing. That's going to be their key proposal going into a general election. Labour's party conference, you'll probably see them on an election footing as well. I think they will go with Brexit being, an important, and it will be all about them saying they're going to stop no deal. Then after that, it will be the repeat of 2017, how they're going to, have more tax, how they're going to fund their social pledges. Then after that comes the Conservatives, which I think will probably be the most tumultuous. It's who's allowed on stage? What Conservative Party are we looking at? Are we looking at the traditional Conservative Party being quite a wide church, having both a Leave and Remain side? Or are we seeing one where Boris Johnson turns it into the Brexit Party 2.0? Boris has already rejected publicly an election pact with Farage for the Brexit Party, but he still wishes to get as many votes from that party as possible. So to see how he reacts on home turf, I think Boris has always found that he speaks easier when he's not got that direct opposition in front of him. We saw that in PMQs where he was quite weak to the cross questioning. He may do better on a conference stage, and I think it was last time where you had Party Conference 2018, Boris was sidelined and he had to go to a fringe event, and his speech there was very well attended. It was clear that Boris was the person who was bringing the crowds. If he can do the same thing now he's leader, it is yet to be seen, and I imagine that those party conferences will still go ahead even if Parliament does come back. I think Boris would... I don't know why Boris would want to go back to Parliament very much at all. It's clear he's not winning anything that he puts forward. So it might be best for him to stay away rather than go back. So that's conference season. Then on to the election. I think as soon as they've, as Labour have said, as soon as they've confirmed that no deal is stopped and they get that confirmation from the EU that January 21st is the new Brexit day, then we'll see everybody kick into election mode.
With the idea being to have an election quickly, so that group of people are the people negotiating the deal.
Yes, precisely. The result of that election, though, is very up in the air at the moment.
Yeah.
And we can move on to the polls if you want, just to show how
Yeah, I think we should move on to a quick polls update then to discuss that. So before we go and have a look at the polls directly, we've just had that bit of a summary there. So we have our three main parties, and just to stress their Brexit views at the moment, the Conservative Party's line is we will leave on the 31st, whatever. But essentially, we know they're going for a no-deal Brexit, as the party is currently led, regardless of whether their members feel that way. Then we have Labour, who are, we will leave and respect the result of the referendum, but we will go for a deal. But basically, they won't go for no deal. They want to have a deal. And then I think, was there some tiny clause whereby they would go for Remain? But I can't remember the exact specific version wording of it.
I believe that they would also have a referendum in there as well, like
a referendum. Yes, a referendum on the deal. So they'd go get a deal, come back and say, okay, you have the option of Remain, this deal, or no deal. There can't be three options in that anymore. If they get rid of no deal, it has to be those two options.
I think, as Jeremy Corbyn has said repeatedly, no deal will have to be off the table. So I believe it will be off the table in the referendum as well.
So it'd be a choice of Remain or their deal, or maybe go and renegotiate a deal, I suppose. But, I mean, I suppose it's easier if it's a two-way choice.
Yeah. Like, I don't think you could have a three-way referendum, because that would lead to... Yeah.
I mean, if you have a three-way choice where one of them is Remain, we're pretty certain, based on polling, Remain would win in that situation. That just sets you up to ensure Remain wins, and then you'd have the same people complaining. You would just get in this endless cycle of referendums, whereas at least if we say, here's the deal or here's Remain, I'm sure some people will be upset if it ended up Remain, but at least you could say we had a proper vote on that as well. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we kept talking the same talking points for the next infinity years. That post that's like, it's the year 3000 and the Prime Minister has once again gone to the EU to request an extension. No one knows what it means anymore, but it's an excuse to have a party. Our third party, the Lib Dems, 2 points to mention. So the Lib Dems had already said they were a Remain party, but they have officially voted in favour of a policy to cancel Brexit and revoke Article 50 if they take power. So they are standing up and saying, we're Remain, vote for us, on that basis, and trying to get more Remain votes that way. And another thing to mention, since this Parliament started, we mentioned a lot of people have been slowly going across the Lib Dems, members of Change UK being like, oh, I don't want to be Change UK, or some independents being like, I don't want to be independent, and also a few Conservatives, or Conservatives who lost the whip, moving across. The Lib Dems in Parliament have grown 50% since they started this parliamentary session. So they started with 12 MPs in the heady days of 2017, and now they have 18 MPs, 6 of which they've gained in the last 2 weeks. So, I mean, actually, if you're a Lib Dem, probably the best strategy is just stay in Parliament and hope everyone eventually joins you.
Yes, I'd like to see that, them just sort of slowly absorbing the centre of every political party around them. That appears to be their strategy anyway. The moment it's talking about like MPs crossing the floor. I saw one the other day. They were talking about sort of like sessions in Parliament, how many MPs have crossed the floor. I think since 2017 we've had over 70 people move party in that time, which is
that's a lot.
That number is slightly inflated by the fact that some people are counted twice. So, for example, Chuka Umunna went from Labour to from Labour to Change UK, then from Change UK to the Lib Dems, and some people like Lucina Berger went from Labour to Change to the Independents to then become Lib Dems. So that counts as 3 moves, even though it's one person.
So a very complicated chess game.
Yes, but the amount of times that people are moving and shifting their allegiance because of Brexit, it shows how this one issue has sort of broken our political system. It doesn't seem to function with Brexit as a variable. It just breaks down.
So I suppose we're going to come into the polls here. So the current standings, which is from the 10th, because as we said before, this trails by a little way. Conservatives. Polls update jingle. I don't know. I'll come up with a better song next time. We do need a polls update jingle, though. Suggestions on a postcard. When my voice is better, I'm happy to sing it. Throw something in. So, yeah. Conservatives, 32.8%. Labour, 24.5%. Lib Dems, 19%. Brexit Party, 13.2%. And Greens, 4.4%. UKIP and Change UK are still technically tracked, but they've fallen off the bottom 5 now. I mean, they had probably fallen off the bottom 5 last time we spoke, but I think it's safe to say that Change UK is dead. and UKIP is dead. And I know we've said UKIP is dead before, but it never dropped below a certain... It always had a few percent before the Brexit Party came along, and now it is down at 0.4%. It is very... like, those UKIPers have come across to the Brexit Party or possibly the Conservative Party. From July onwards, the Brexit Party has been taking a nosedive, and those people have been going over to the Conservatives. But in the last few weeks, since the end of August, you've seen Conservative parties start to dip again, and those Brexit Party votes are coming back up again. So there's an interesting dynamic there, and if the Conservative Party hit this at the wrong time, you could very much see votes going to the Brexit Party and splitting that kind of right-wing Brexit vote, which would be interesting. Lib Dems have had like a bit of a boost. They're up 1% since end of August, so they've kind of had they've had a jump. And I think that's, as we say, likely there are people like who would vote for Chuka or other people who've come across, and also there's probably some Remain people coming from Labour. Labour's kind of holding a bit steady. It's lost a little bit, but it's kind of holding steady. And the Green Party is slowly dipping down, which isn't necessarily surprising. I imagine there's a bit of transference there between the Lib Dems and the Greens as well. But it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, totally. We've got where usually the dynamic would be between left and right, between the Conservatives and the Labour. We now see the Conservative. We now see the right split between the Conservatives and the Brexit Party, and the left split between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. If any one of those parties, if Labour could absorb all of the Liberal Democrat votes, then that would put them on, let me do some quick math, in my head, 43%. If the Conservatives adapted all of the Brexit Party votes, that would put them on 46%. So if you do it like that, it looks very, very close. But politics doesn't work like that. People aren't going to have these, great alliances. So any one of these parties could benefit from the other's misfortune, and it's kind of a race to see who can slip up first. The Conservatives will be really worried again that, Boris Johnson has talked about October 31st. If he is undermined and if he is forced to go to the EU and extend this, then that will once again undermine the whole Conservative project, and you'll see a lot of people jump across to the Brexit Party, I feel. The other important thing to just point out about the polling at the moment is that, so traditionally, polls kind of converge around a similar feeling. They all go, you look at the polls and you say, how come from all those independent polling companies, all of them have the Conservatives ahead by 6 points, for example? If you just scroll down and have a look, you've got some people like YouGov and Kantar who have been polling since like the 6th of September and the 9th of September. So through this Boris Johnson crisis, they've got the Conservatives on plus 14. So that seems mad that they could be 14 points ahead of Labour despite all of the things that have gone wrong for Boris Johnson. However, you look at the ComRes poll and the Delta poll from the 7th of September and the 8th, and they've got the Conservatives on +1 and +3 respectively, with Labour only, very closely behind. The fact that we've got such a difference in these polling companies suggests that a lot of different possibilities are there come a general election. Usually you can look at polls and say, yeah, the Conservatives are probably going to win this, or, vice versa. Now I would really struggle to know where I put my money. I think the Lib Dem, the surprising rise of the Lib Dems and how consistently they've been able to keep their poll numbers, it rose a lot during the EU and the local elections. The fact they've been able to keep those people on board and they haven't just slipped back to Labour is really impressive. As a party, for the party as a whole. However, they're playing a dangerous game where if they split the vote on the left and the Conservatives get in because Labour and the Lib Dems split the vote between them, then it could lead to a no-deal Brexit, which is exactly against what the Lib Dems actually want. So I think the next point in the polls to see where they change is through that general election campaign, or when one is called. Are people prepared to vote tactically in their area to stop the Conservatives getting in? Because that's usually what happens during elections. People vote tactically to stop a party getting in, or to associate another one. It's being a Lib Dem voter, I'm very familiar with this practice. So,
do we have any feeling on? Because I suppose this is something that would be good to delve into in silly season episode, do we have any feeling on how, when people are polled, how likely are they to say they're going to tactically vote, I suppose? So because it's supposed to be voting intention as in who you will actually vote for. But if someone is a traditional Lib Dem, would they say Lib Dem even if they're going to vote Labour in that election because that's going to help them out locally? I don't know what level of checking they do on that. And obviously you can't see someone's actual ballot. So
I think if you go to the YouGov website, you can see all the raw data for the polls and every question they asked. And when I've looked from it, I don't think I remember there being a, by the way, you voting tactically question on this. The question is always, if there was a general election tomorrow, who would you vote for? Right, so I think a lot of people are voting with their gut on that. They're just saying, if you ask me who I would vote for, I would say Lib Dem. However, when it comes to it in my constituency, I know the Lib Dems can't win, and the best bet to keep Jacob Rees-Mogg out would be voting Labour. So I'd vote Labour. But that was not the question you asked me. If you're asking me which part, given a free choice, and if I was allowed, if proportional representation was a thing and who I would vote for, I would say Lib Dem. So all of that, I feel like, goes into those polling numbers. So that's why it can be skewed, particularly for those third parties.
Yeah. So I think, as always, take a pinch of salt when looking at the polls.
Yep.
And we'll obviously have to pay good attention as we run into a general election. And then obviously the general election itself is the best poll because it is a vote. So we get all the numbers and we know who's voted for what. But yeah, okay. Well, I suppose that's it for this week. Thank you very much for joining me, Rob, for a slightly longer than usual episode. It was a long time in politics that week that we've just had. If you like what we hear, the best way to help us out as a podcast, other than giving us money via our Patreon, is to spread the word, let people know that you like this podcast. Podcasts are spread by word of mouth more than anything else. Although if you do want to pop into your app of choice and give us a rating and subscribe, that helps as well. Come and find us in all the usual places. So there's parliamentary.observer, our website, where you can comment on the episodes. You can always come and join us on Discord. There's a link in the show notes that gets you into our Discord server where you can listen to our live recordings. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. And you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at unparlpodcast. And we also upload episodes to YouTube if you're so inclined to watch them there instead of listening to them in a podcast app. I think that's all the list of things we're on. There's still movement on doing like a special crossover episode of Mishmash Mayhem. We'll let you know when that comes out. Other than this, there's Mishmash Mayhem will have gone up as we're recording this, so that will be there in the feed, the latest episode of that. And we've got a new episode of Hat Many Things coming up soon as well on the network. So that will be on the Three Kingdoms in China. That was fascinating, chatting to someone who has read a lot in depth on the Three Kingdoms. Very much scratching the surface. But if you're interested in that, go over to the Hat Many Things feed and listen to that.
Have they played Dynasty Warriors? Because that's all I know about the Three Kingdoms. That's
how I was in that discussion. So yes, it was. If you have played just Dynasty Warriors or heard of Dynasty Warriors, then this is the podcast that will fill you in on all the backstory and all the crazy stories that led to that. So yeah, go ahead and listen to that. I think other than that, all that remains to be said. I think all that remains to be said is it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Do 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 do.
Yes.
And now in Final Jeopardy.
Sorry, what is party conference season? Yeah, no.